Landlords are taking New York City to court to crush Mayor Zohran Mamdani's rent freeze.
1 year lease, 0%. 2 year lease, 0%.
So landlords claim that City Hall actually rigged that historic Rent Guidelines Board vote that created a rent freeze for up to 2 years. But if a judge actually sides with landlords, well, that is going to create unprecedented chaos for nearly 2 million renters here in New York City. So here's how this legal gamble could work, and also what it means for an estimated 57,000 empty rent-stabilized apartments right now in New York City. So who actually qualifies for a rent freeze? Well, the Rent Guidelines Board decision actually affects an estimated 1 million apartments across New York City, like I said, 2 million renters, and it would take effect on lease renewals starting on October 1st of 2026. And for the first time, the board actually voted for a rent freeze for not just 1-year leases, but also 2-year leases as well. That means that you could have the same rent you're paying right now in 2028, maybe even 2029, depending on when your lease is up. So let's get into that lawsuit. It was filed on Staten Island by a group of landlords who own properties across New York City, and the defendant is the New York City Rent Guidelines Board. Now, in it, they argue that the decision to freeze the rent on both 1- and 2-year leases was a predetermined outcome and the result of a political agenda. Of course, Mamdani made it a core campaign promise.
If you're one of the more than 2 million New Yorkers who lives in a rent-stabilized apartment, your rent's going to be frozen next year.
So if proven true, having politics actually influence the RGB decision is illegal because the board has a statutory obligation to consider current economic climates when deciding on increases. The New York City Code is crystal clear on this. The law requires the board to consider real estate taxes, water, sewer, maintenance costs, financing costs and interest rates, housing supply and vacancy data, also cost of living indices as well. The lawsuit claims the board did not consider the costs being incurred by landlords. It also accuses the board of manipulating the data to arbitrarily support a rent freeze when the conditions for one did not exist, saying in part, quote, the board's June 25th determination was the result of a corrupted and compromised process. So how likely is this lawsuit to proceed? Well, landlords actually sued the de Blasio administration back in 2016, 10 years ago, and they actually lost in court. But this is a completely different case because back then, plaintiffs were arguing that the panel improperly based a decision on tenant affordability. That argument went nowhere because the statute gives the board pretty wide discretion on what to consider. There's really no set formula for calculating rent changes. They could even vote to reduce the rent if they wanted. In fact, some board members tried to do that earlier this year.
For apartments, 1-year lease, -3% to 0%. A 2-year lease, -4.5% to 0%.
That motion failed, but it does show you that this board does have some pretty wide-ranging power. But the premise of this lawsuit is different. They're claiming that Mamdani improperly meddled, though in that way, this lawsuit is unlike anything that's really come before it, and it represents a real test of the power limits of City Hall. A spokesperson for City Hall told Politico, quote, the Rent Guidelines Board is an independent body. We are confident that the board evaluated all of the relevant data and considered the factors facing both tenants and landlords across New York City, adding the Mamdani administration remains committed to the success of the rent stabilization system, which has prevented displacement and provided stability to generations of New Yorkers. And the plaintiff's core argument here that the Mamdani administration improperly meddled was actually already undercut by a board member, the sole member to vote against the rent freeze. His name is Arpit Gupta, and he was actually appointed by Mayor Eric Adams. Listen to this. According to Politico, he said, quote, I observed no interference by the administration in the individual members' decisions. He says, I have to credit the administration on that independence, and I have to credit the professional, hardworking staff who provided excellent data and services. So now that discretion is left up to a judge because there's going to be a virtual hearing on this coming up on September 2nd. And then let's game this out. What happens if the landlords actually win? Well, chaos could ensue. Things could get very messy. For starters, the board is not going anywhere. So this same board that voted for the 2-year rent freeze will then come and vote again. So you can't really imagine a scenario either way where the landlords are going to get the kinds of increases that they believe they deserve. And also courts move very slowly. This hearing is in September. That's a few weeks before this whole thing is supposed to take effect on October 1st. That's when anyone living in a rent-stabilized apartment whose building lease is up for renewal can choose to renew for up to 2 years at the same rate they're paying right now. So there could be a scenario where the rent freeze goes into effect and then a judge annuls it after the fact. So what does that even look like? Would you suddenly owe more rent? This is really an unprecedented scenario. And then let's not forget this decision would likely face an appeal. So if the judge were to hand the plaintiffs a win, this would then kick off a lengthy legal process, and tenants are really left in limbo. And whether this rent freeze fails or succeeds in court, it really exposes the elephant in the room here. There's a deeper problem with New York City regulations that has left 57,000 rent-stabilized apartments sitting totally empty right now. That number from the city's Department of Housing Preservation and Development, putting the rent-stabilized vacancy rate at 5.4%. That's up from 3.7% a decade ago. Now, for every other kind of apartment, the vacancy rate is 1.4%, and that's really fueling these record high rent prices that we've been seeing lately.
The median rent in Manhattan rose to $5,000 a month in February, and in Brooklyn, $4,296.
Landlords right now say that they can't afford to fix some of these lower-priced rent-stabilized units, and that's before this rent freeze takes effect. Now, in a recent video, I actually toured an apartment in the Bronx that rents for $800 a month, but it's been empty since the last tenant moved out in 2022. It needs a lot of work, including lead abatement, new floors, and maybe even electrical as well.
Why is this apartment still vacant so many years later?
Because the law today says that when the tenant moves out, you still, of course, before law and after, you would have to upgrade and renovate this unit and bring it up to the current housing standard of 2026. The difference is now the law says we don't really care what you spend. You cannot change the rent from the previous tenant. So what happens is owners are unwilling to spend six figures in a sum of money.
Landlords say the 2019 rent reform law made it even more difficult to afford to maintain these buildings. It got rid of something called the 20% vacancy bonus that allows property owners to raise the rent by as much as 20% after a tenant moves out. Now, I spoke to State Assemblywoman Linda Rosenthal about this. She's actually the chair of the Housing Committee, and she has no sympathy for landlords.
We found that with the 20% vacancy bonus, it was an incentive for landlords to harass tenants out. Finally, we righted the scales. Landlords didn't like that, and what they said immediately after we passed it was, we're going to keep apartments off the market.
So the rent freeze may be good for tenants already living in those units, but it does absolutely nothing to fix a systemic, long-term problem. Now, history has shown that a rent freeze reversal is unlikely. Still, there's really never been a challenge quite like this one, and so now it's going to be up to a judge to decide what happens next.